Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us today. We're very appreciative of Childcare Now for inviting both Andrea and myself to talk about this wonderful tool that we'll be exploring for the next hour. And it's called the Family Manifesto. And there's a lot of individuals and organizations leading up to this to ensure that this tool was able to be developed and then piloted in many of the communities in Edmonton. So on behalf of Andrea and myself, I just want to start with thanking those organizations, including Multicultural Health Brokers, University of Alberta, Multilingual Families, and with our generous donor partners, Early Learning and Childcare. Um, I know you did the land acknowledgement, but I just want to reiterate how most of the work behind Family Manifesto was done in Edmonton with families and communities and educators. And we just wanted to acknowledge that we live and work on Treaty 6 territory in Métis Region 4. And this is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people whose history, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Um, Before we dive into the tool itself, we just wanted to do a little bit of a context building of who was the target population of interest, but also generally why was the tool developed, and what led to the motivation of sort of that idea of this tool, what we call the Family Manifesto. It was previously known as Parent Manifesto. We know that the childcare space is sort of the first system where the family is exposed to outside of their homes. When a child is born, they have that warm and lovely home for them to care by the parents, by the caregivers, by the family. And the childcare system is the first sort of interface that for the family, but most importantly for that child to grow and develop outside of the vicinity of the home. And it sets the pathway for what the child sort of sees themselves, but also the society at large. We also understand that the population that we particularly co-developed this tool with, the ethnocultural and multilingual families with diverse cultures, ethnicity, languages, and identity, many of them are immigrants and refugees to this country. And when working with such populations, it's very important to understand the pre-migration, the situations, the stories, the past that led for them to flee or immigrate to Canada, but also the post-migration barriers and struggles that are sort of the first few years of settlement that many of the families go through. And this tool very much sort of dives into those pre and post migration contexts to support families. We also know that within our society, and especially when we're working with a system like childcare, there's a lot of trusted intermediaries who are needed to advocate, who are needed to empower the families, but also handhold with them to bridge language, culture, and support the emergence of relationships. And this whole work of the Family Manifesto sets on the bedrock of relationships and families as experts. Our families, despite their circumstances of pre and post migration, have a lot to contribute and something we'll talk about in the coming slides. At the center of this work was culture itself. And culture is sort of a term that's been passed around, floating around for quite some time. And culture is something that's part and parcel of everyday life and transmitted through day-to-day activities. And we see culture everywhere. Sometimes culture has those visible markers like food, dresses, that's very much visible, that's very much present in communities. But culture also has an invisible aspect of it, the way we work, the way we sort of communicate with people, the way we interact with individuals alongside, the way our beliefs and values and orientation work. Everything is colored by culture. And in the early learning and childcare context, culture becomes a very important sort of marker for the child because by representing that culture of the child from their home is a way of saying to the child that you belong here. This is something that's not alien or foreign, but something that's part of who you are. The childcare space is something that makes that child feel a sense of belonging in the most crucial part of their development. And that's why in many contexts, culture is promoted through various means, through very much explicit markers of language, food, storytelling, music, but it's also promoted through how the relationships are built in that center, whether the teachers are sort of how they're communicating with the parents on a daily basis, what kind of information they're passing, what's the mode of information, are they oral, are they written, what languages they're opting for. So culture is very much part and parcel of an early learning environment. And it really comes back to how the culture sort of is culture of the families, culture of the space, but also culture of the educators is promoted through various aspects of the early learning and childcare space.
Um, so as we think about culture and the importance of thinking about our own culture and the culture of the families and children that we serve, we want to think about, well, how do we create a structure or way of thinking about culturally affirming and sustaining and empowering approaches? Um, Through our work together, we've really it's led us to explore different types of models, and one that we really think is quite powerful is Yoso's model of community cultural wealth. What we really appreciate about this model is it's one that centers the knowledge and the experiences of individuals who experience marginalization, and also the experiences of their community. In this model, Yoso identified six capitals that are fostered by communities and their families. So these capitals include linguistic capital, so basically the language and languages that the families and communities use. Capitals within their family, so those connections within one's um, immediate family, but also those extensions that might go across provincial barriers, might also be globally. Social connections, navigation, so being able to find one's way, being able to access resources, and those resources might be ones that the family and community support within that immediate ethnocultural community, but it may also be resources that the community helps the family navigate with the mainstream community. She also speaks about aspirational capital. So, what are the dreams and the hopes that the families have for themselves and for their children? And resistance capital. So, being able to push back on some of the mainstream expectations when they don't align with the family's culture or values. To be able to question, to be able to find other ways of succeeding that may not always be those that the mainstream system lays out. Um, so when we think of culturally sustaining practices, these are all practices that will contribute to build these capitals and also help families sustain the capitals. So we can, yeah. So we've talked a lot about the families, but we also know that partnerships with school, and we include early learning contexts in that big picture of school slash education, is really important. So um, partnerships with the education system are critical for families who experience trauma and displacement. We also know that educators may feel unsure of how to accommodate children from ethnocultural communities, how to pivot learning activities to suit their needs, and to teach in a way that's culturally sustaining. So there may be a shared value of wanting to do it, but how to do it often feels challenging, or there's a lot of uncertainty there. We also know that families and children, especially from immigrant and refugee families, have a lot of strengths that can positively contribute to the child's development. But despite those strengths being present, sometimes they're not seen. And this is part of what we're trying to do with the Family Manifesto tool, is to help families communicate these strengths, to shine a light on them, and to also help educators really be able to build on those and to see them for themselves. So we're really hoping that this tool can serve to help build these bridges between the home and the early education contexts. So, what is this family manifesto? So, The Family Manifesto, in terms of the words, really embraces the radical roots of the word manifesto. So when we first talked about this, we thought of different words, and our mentor, Yvonne, really challenged us to say, well, let's use the manifesto. I think we need to express the urgency and the importance of resisting the current mainstream dominant ideologies. So it's a lot of words, but this is really part of that resistance capital of being able to say, like, no, we have needs, and their needs are not being met at the moment, and we really need to have a tool that makes it clear that this is not just suggestions. This is really us advocating for ourselves, for our families. So the manifesto aims to be a framework to support parents and community leaders in feeling confident in advocating for their child, for their culture, and their language within an early learning and childcare context. So we place the family at the forefront. We really asked questions and designed it around what's meaningful to that family, and really aim to have the family feel and parents feel like they can advocate for their needs. So it's a tool to support parents and families and communities in resisting these dominant systems that are present in the ELCC. And to the right of the slide, you can kind of see an overview of the first page of the Family Manifesto. Um, what we'll do next is talk a little bit about the design and implementation, and then we'll talk really in detail, step you through what the manifesto looks like, and then how we've been implementing it. So as Nahid mentioned at the beginning, this tool really emerged from conversations with community members and community leaders around the importance of having families' needs and aspirations recognized in their early learning and childcare contexts, and that this was often quite challenging for individual families. So by working collectively, we may have more success in being able to really work together to bring a bigger voice to the table. So these needs were expressed by cultural brokers and families. And some of this emerged from Pathways from the Journeys project, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And some key principles that were articulated and informal feedback that we received. So when we were conceptualizing it, we built on these key principles and gathered some feedback and then shared this first model. We shared the first model with families and cultural brokers and really asked for their unfiltered feedback. What did they think? What was working? What needed to be adjusted? What should we just get rid of that wasn't helpful? And we revised this model and adapted it to inform the pilot testing or the pilot implementation. So even before we brought this for the pilot, we actually went through several phases, made it much more usable, much more readable, and easier to work with if you're doing a translation, either or interpreting and using this tool. This came to our pilot implementation with communities, and we'll talk a bit about this. And we've also been piloting an implementation with educators, and we'll share about what we learned from that. And so let's start looking at the tool.
Perfect. So we'll demystify it a little bit for you, and then perhaps at the end of the presentation, we'll give you access to it. It's a tool that has gone through multiple reiterations, as Andrea talked about, and it started. We thought perhaps we had what we call within multicultural health brokers, cultural brokers. These are community leaders that themselves have been refugees and immigrants from long time ago, have settled in, and have now become community leaders to guide many of the newcomers and arriving families. And they became sort of our experts on this. In addition to that, some of the earlier work was done with many of the families out there. In order to dive into the Family Manifesto, we needed some sort of an opening letter. And this is what you can see, the introduction, where we directly address the educator, the early learning and childcare educator or the leader, and talk about why is there a need for sort of really promoting the home culture and the languages of the child. And in addition to that, we wanted to put in a little bit research out there. But then when we went through multiple phases of pilot testing, they said it's too complicated and too academic sounding. So we went back to the drawing board and made it a little bit more simpler and easier, and also providing language to the parents to advocate for the child from an evidence-based lens. So the opening letter talks, it's written from a parental voice. It talks about how in this country of Canada, it's so important that we raise our children with their home culture and their languages and values. And they invite or bring along the educator to join them on that journey. So that element of partnership that Andrea talked about is very much articulated and explicitly highlighted in the language, that we as parents and educators have a great deal of influence, and we can build positive relationship to make sure that this child is sort of is able to get its highest potential by working together. On the right hand side of the slide, you'll see what I was talking about in terms of advocating from a research-based lens. So here, the parent explains that doing this kind of work where you're promoting the culture and the languages and the family's heritage is not something that's disruptive to the class. In fact, it's something that will help the child be confident. It will help them learn the language of the home. It would help them feel a sense of pride and connection. And these are all research based, but you won't see quotations out there, just for the parent to really show to the educator that this is something that we're doing for the child and it's beneficial in a longer term. And then the opening letter ends with how education is really important to my family, and we know it is challenging to be a teacher. And this is something that time and time again, even in the last project of journeys that we talked about, came up, that parents and families have a lot of appreciation for early learning and childcare. They know it's hard being a teacher. And that's why the Family Manifesto provides sort of a support system, that how can parents leverage their knowledge with the teachers to bring in some of the culturally responsive work that's part of the early learning and childcare curriculum and goals. So this is the opening letter. As before we dive into the two-page sort of questions that the parent fills out, I'll talk a little bit about the pre-migration experiences and the post-migration experiences, because those are some things that are very much highlighted in the Parent Manifesto. Many of the families that come through various countries around the world, they have a lot of common experience of loss and hope. Sometimes there's this assumption that immigrants and migrants have is a monolith. They're sort of going through the same journey, but each individual family has their own journey to get to Canada from their land of origin or their home country. If you see the picture on the side, this is an earlier project called Raised Through Culture, where the participants were asked to mark what are some of the stopovers before while leaving their home country and arriving to Canada. What are some of the places they stopped at for shorter and longer term before they made it? And you can see a family mapped out their journey from Sierra Leone to Morocco to Turkey to Greece to Macedonia to Serbia, and finally landing in Canada. And many of the stories that we hear from our families that we work with is similar, that sometimes that migration story is not so simple, where you leave the country, flee, and come in, or come in through different motivations. It's a long and arduous journey. And sometimes many of the children actually pick up languages and cultures as they stay over. So we have many children that may look a particular culture. For example, we have a lot of Turkish families out there that are coming originally from Central Asia or Afghanistan, but they speak Turkey because they've lived there for 4 or 5 years. They picked up the language, and these children might not speak Persian. They might speak Dari. They might speak Turkish. So as the families make their journey, they pick up the cultures, the values, the orientations alongside. And that is something that needs to be focused on in the early learning, to ask the parents, what are some of the influences influences? What are some of the values? And these sometimes are not necessarily as straightforward. We also know that pre-migration experiences continue to influence child and family even after they move. So many of the orientations from which they work from are very much based in the culture back home, or again that migration journey that they're taking place. We, for example, have learned that their idea of what an educator is supposed to be is very different than many of our notions of a dominant way of teaching. So parents perhaps won't even question the teacher sometimes because their teachers were seen as authoritative back home and someone you could not question. So pre-migration knowledge and experience influence a lot of interactions as the family settles down and interacts with school, with healthcare and assessment. And that's something that the Family Manifesto sort of dives into to ask them a little bit about their journey, where they're from, what languages, and we'll see that in a bit. In addition to that, we also know that the first couple of years of my settlement is very hard for our families. They're dealing with a lot of economic crisis, and social isolation. Back home, they had bonds, relationships, and extended family to do many of the purposes that our system does now, like childcare, for example. The child was probably sometimes was raised by the extended families or grandparents, aunts and uncles. But here is the early learning sector doing it at a population level. We also know that many of our families, despite speaking multiple languages, might have language and cultural barriers when they speak little or no English or no French in many of the parts of Canada. And lastly, there's the whole idea of the systemic racism and discrimination. Many of the families, as they're settling down, are there are circumstances beyond their control, but also the unequal power balances within the early learning and childcare sector can result in a lot of psychological trauma and re-trauma after settling down. So that's another thing that we have to be mindful of. And that's something that the tool was designed in a way with the communities that how do we really go from a lens of curiosity, genuine care, but also in terms of not traumatizing by asking such questions. It also gives one of the things about the Family Manifesto is that through we ask the community, what are some of the questions you would like us to ask you? Because in many circumstances, and this is something that me as an early learning educator has always felt this uneasiness of asking the families and not traumatizing them as a result. So this tool also provides the language to how in a very genuine way to ask the families about their stories and letting the family be the storyteller in that way, whether what they choose to uncover or tell and what they choose to not disclose. So that's another purpose of that tool is to provide language to the educators. The second page is sort of that guide of questions that we or prompts as we call it that could be used to for the family to talk a little bit about different aspects of their life going back to pre-migration, post-migration, but also in terms of their fears and challenges. So it starts off addressing directly to the teacher of the child. And then it says this document will give you a sense of who we are, what is important to us in the growth and education of our child. And we hope this helps us build a strong partnership to support the child's name together. The first section is very simple, where the family talks about who they are, their names, where they're originally from, when did they migrate to Canada, in what year, so that educator gets a sense of how long they've been in the country, and then the child's name and their age. Very simple, and this is something we're starting off with very much demographic information. Then we talk about the child a little bit, and yeah, we'll talk about this. But this tool was both piloted as a written document, so families can write the answers down. But it's also an audio visual where they can use the prompts to create a small clip or video, audio or visual for the educators. The second section really focuses on the child. And this is where when we were doing the learnings and the reflection on the findings, it brought a big smile to our face because here the parent talks about their child, some qualities that they admire about the child, some of the deepest hopes and aspirations for their child. And that was very powerful to see how many of the hopes and aspirations are very much in line with what the teachers would want, what the educators would want for the child. And lastly, the educational sort of hope for the child. So I want my child to gain the following from their educational experiences. And an interesting thing that we'll find in the findings is this is so broad that the parents not only talk about academic success, but it's also about a holistic child development because parents, again, have the same vision for that child that the educators in the early learning sector has. The last section of this child and family section, sort of a subsection that we have on manifesto, is to talk is a space for the parents to talk about some of the fears and past challenges that they've had with the child care. And this was deliberately included because many times parents are operating from this past experiences of fears, negative experiences, but also some of the worries that they may have that might not be there's sometimes no time within the early learning space to talk about this. So this is why it was explicitly included there, where the parents can talk about some of the challenges that they've faced in their previous experiences, but also sometimes experiences and what they're worried about, what are their fears. Um, the and this is the last section of the manifesto, one of the things that really honors and celebrates the knowledge of the parents and the families. A beginning question in this section, the subsection, we call it the our language and culture, and it starts with the parents really naming the languages that they speak at home. And we see this in the sector time and time again, that based on how the child looks, where the family is from, we make assumptions about what the languages are at home. And sometimes they're on point, but sometimes they're completely off. And in that sort of inquiry, we discovered that the family not only speaks one majority languages, but also minority or languages that we might not be aware of, and something that could be brought in. In addition to that, families are asked to share some of the ways of bringing the home culture. So we asked them to have some common and favorite words and expressions in their home language, sharing books and stories, sharing music in their home language, and also some traditions. And took some reiterations to put them in. First, we had left it a blank section for them to share anything, and then I think with some of the feedback we got, we made it into some options, but also keeping it open ended. Similarly, we asked the families to share from their home culture a cultural item they would like to bring, a food or a recipe that they would like to share, a moment of a celebration in their home culture. Again, we may celebrate dominant events and celebrations, but through this, we were able to uncover many traditional cultural celebrations that the families might celebrate in the vicinity of their home, but also the unique way they might celebrate many of the dominant celebrations. And lastly, it's an open-ended if they want to share anything else. We also ask the families about their comfort with English, so low, medium, of high. And then the last line of the manifesto talks about that if there's any resources that are helpful that the teacher or the educator recognizes, the family would love to have access to it. And then the parent signs it off. And you're pleased that if I may have missed before, yeah, we go.
No, it's really great. So in our first implementation, we worked with 22 parents from three different ethnocultural communities in Edmonton. So we worked with the Franco-African community, Vietnamese, and Chinese communities. Um, we were able with our partnership, which includes multicultural health brokers, work with a cultural broker on our team to develop a model of the manifesto for each community, and then to present this to families. So we had a written and also, as Nahid mentioned, an audiovisual uh, manifesto model. And so families could respond in the way that they felt most comfortable. And thanks to our multilingual team and the Multilingual Families Lab, we were able to also gather this data, translate it, and analyze it to generate some overall pictures of what was occurring in this data. So we'll talk about some of those preliminary sharings that families made in the next slides. So when we heard from parents' hopes and aspirations, we have some quotes here, and I won't read all of them, but I'll highlight, for example, one Chinese parent who spoke about that their aspiration for their child is that they are happy and healthy, and also I hope that they can keep our heritage, culture, and languages. I also hope their children continue this trend. So we can see for them that importance of their culture and language in terms of what they hope for the future of their child. We also heard about parents, for example, in the second one, that they want their child to assimilate into Canada and take pride in knowing our own culture. That they have studied and worked in both Chinese and English environments since they were young, and bilingualism will help them find a lot of work. So we can see some of those aspirations and what the families are valuing. We'll move to the next one. And when thinking about fears and challenges, families mentioned different challenges. Um, so one Vietnamese parent shared that the school's language is English and my child's receptiveness to the program, discrimination, and teachers who don't monitor students thoroughly. So really experiencing both challenges that they've encountered and fears that they have. Franco-African parents shared that for immigrants and those who do not, who have not worked yet and have French language as their first language, it's difficult to find a daycare and also hard to communicate with the staff at the daycare. So we hear their challenges related to some of these language barriers, and this includes French that sometimes we think is one of the official languages in Canada, and yet even with that language being widespread, there still are pretty really important language barriers when somebody isn't as comfortable in English. And families also shared some concrete strategies for promoting their home language and home culture. So this is an example from one parent from the Franco-African community that shared about different words. So some just, common words that their child uses, like "ache" for thank you or "blah" for come, the word for go and washed. Favorite foods, so alière, which is a semolina or flour with fried fish dish, with fried plantain bananas. So we can see this is like a favorite food that the child may talk about, and helps even if there's a menu in the early educator setting, the being able to understand what the child is talking about also helps to build those connections. And maybe even find ways, like, is there ways to integrate some of these foods in our spaces? And also about different cultural items. So she talked about a type of cloth that was traditional to the Ivory Coast. And that may be something that the child could bring in for a show and tell or to share with their classmates. So from these preliminary or ways that we find to bring it into early learning settings, we do know that we have this familiarization and building comfort with a family manifesto tool. And what we wanted to explore, we did this first work with the families themselves. And the next step, which we're engaged in at the moment, is really talking to educators about what is their experience using this tool, how has it helped. Are there ways that we can help structure or suggest in terms of how you bring this to families or to other educators that would be helpful in its implementation? So we heard these different voices from educators. So far we've been working with educators in the Edmonton day homes. And we've spoken with 32 early educators at this point. So, what we've heard from them on the importance of including the family's culture and language, educators have highlighted the importance of that. For them, by gaining the perspective of families and their needs, it helps for the educator to highlight what actions that they can take to better serve the individuals in their care. Another educator spoke about the importance of supporting home culture and language, saying it helps them feel connected to their roots and boosts their confidence and identity. Plus, it makes learning more fun and relevant for them. So, not only does it have kind of these identity building positive aspects, but it also really helps bring and engage the children into the learning process. Another spoke that children should feel supported and confident in their culture and languages for better outcomes in their learning, belonging, overall health, both outside the home and with their families. So we see the educators had a lot of knowledge about what the importance of these languages and cultures that are used and practiced by families. They also spoke about ways to include and learn about the family's culture and language. So, what we're really enjoying from these conversations is also learning from them about what they're up to, what are some strategies. And we're doing this in a focus group approach, which is really fun because other educators get to learn from one another. So they share, like, oh, I like that idea. I'm going to try that next time. Or, oh, wow, you did that. I don't know. I tried it once. Maybe I'll try it again. So one talked about taking time to talk with families and learn about their cultural traditions, values, and languages, and that this helps them better understand and respect the child's identity. Talking about inviting families to share what form of their home culture they would like to be shared in the forms of dance or song, storytelling, language, and other traditions. And I really enjoy this or appreciate the use of the word invite. So the Family Manifesto is really about allowing families to share, but also inviting them to share. When it's not forcing them, they can decide to keep certain things. You know what? This is a practice that's really best done within our own community or our own family. And I don't need to see that being reflected in my child's childcare setting. But there's other practices where, like, yeah, it'd be really great if they could hear more of our music or if they could see that other people are curious about some of our traditions or our celebrations. Another educator talked about bringing that she could learn a few basic phrases in their home language, and it could make a big difference. It would help these children feel more comfortable sharing their languages with me. And another talked about different resources, such as reading books, finding songs, looking on the internet to even find out where a family came from. So we're really learning a lot and also learning that the tool has been a great uh, um, kind of bridge builder to support these conversations. So in terms of the implications for practice, I think this is you, Nahid, so I'll let you go for it.
No worries. So I think as we conclude the webinar today, I think even though the manifesto was made for a particular population of ethnocultural families, newcomer families, multilingual families, the implications for practice are quite wide. And that's something that we've learned from our educator community as well, that no matter what, I think we have so much expertise in the form of families within our spaces. And why not leveraging their knowledges, their experiences? And that's one thing that's behind the motivation behind the Parent Manifesto is to really empower families, ethnocultural families, multilingual families. We've also seen this area that's right now unexplored is how can neurodivergent families also advocate about sort of their needs to the manifesto as well, to advocate for their child in the early learning space. So essentially, it's this tool where really that unequal power that we talked about, it really sort of dents it through and gives that power back to the parent to say, this is what I bring to the table. This is something I can sort of influence in terms of my knowledge at a curriculum level, at the early learning environmental level, but also at the learning level of the child. It also helps and it uses the parent's expertise to support home language and culture. It also facilitates inclusion and belonging by ensuring that each family gets that center mic to talk about and gets that voice to talk about who they are, what their hopes and aspirations are, what they want out of early learning and childcare, and how can they help and support, creating a very strong home partnership for each individual child in that center. It also improves access and navigation. We know through multiple decades of work, but even recently, how access and navigation to community resources has been a challenge. But it also really helps advance equity, one of the crucial principles of the work that all of us do, by creating opportunities to make the early learning space a shared co-design space with the people that are not just mere consumers, but also somebody who has a stake in it and who sends their child trusting the educator that they'll be well taken care of, and their pathway for the future is built with love, care, but also regard for who that child is and what they'll grow up to be in this world. So with that, we'll thank all of you. Our email
Maybe
address.
I'll just flip back just 1 second to add in a little note around what you were saying around, as you were mentioning, the Family Manifesto Tool. We talked a lot about ethnocultural communities. And I think really thinking of this tool as something that we can use with all families, but also that sometimes, like it's happened to my family, where people assume a lot based on what I look like. So I'm a bilingual family. My husband's an immigrant to Canada. And so we actually have some of these experiences that we've talked about today. But because I'm the mom picking up the kids, the educators may not even think to ask me some of these questions. So being having the opportunity for all parents to think about, well, what are the aspects of our culture that we'd like to see reflected? And for all our children to feel like their languages and their cultures are valued and celebrated. And I think this tool is a really great step in that direction. So I'll let you wrap up, Nahid.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrea, for mentioning that. And it doesn't have to be this one-time exercise either. It could, we've learned from educators that they have incorporated some of the questions in their intake surveys, in their intake interviews, sometimes when they have a little bit more of a time where parents are hanging around parental nights or parental evenings, they can bring some of these questions. So the Parent Manifesto as a tool, but even as sort of providing that language or that accessibility to open up conversations with from family, and we know that the families have endorsed and told us that these are the questions. Ask me that actually. That helps me feel more dignified or helps me really bring out that knowledge. So Andrea has shared a link in the chat for you to download Manifesto. We really hope that the tool that was designed by the community for the community, and while it's getting piloted with the with the early learning educator community, you can please take a look at it. Please use it in the current work and let us know. We have our emails here. If it's something that can be improved on, if you have any suggestions, but how effective it has been to really go back to some of the principles we highlighted in terms of inclusion, belonging, and celebrating the strengths. So with that, we'll put our email addresses there and I'll hand it back to Susan. And once again, thank you for being here today in your lunch hour.